go ahead if you would and turn to Luke 11. We're going to be looking today at verses 5 through 10, and we're continuing with the parables. And this is the parable of the friend at midnight. See, Dean, what did he do last week? He did the Good Samaritan, and I get the parable of the friend at midnight. No, I'm not complaining. I love it. But I think all the unknown ones, he says, oh, Lucas, why don't you take that one? But it's good for me because I've got to dig and really stretch myself in learning. But this is an amazing parable. Again, we're going to start with verses 5 through 10. But I want to put it in the context of what's going on here. So in the verses just prior, you see Jesus is praying, and the disciples come and they ask Jesus, teach us to pray. Teach us to pray like you pray. And here is where Jesus gives them the Lord's Prayer. He gives them kind of an outline, if you will, of how you should pray. And then within this context of prayer, Jesus says, this is when you pray, this is how you ought to pray. And then we get into the parable, which is directly after that, within the context of prayer, going on to say, and this is how you should persist in your prayer. This is how you should continue to pray. Okay, so again, Luke 11, verses 5 through 10. And he, Jesus, said to them, which of you who has a friend will go to him at midnight and say to him, friend, lend me 3 loaves? For a friend of mine has arrived on a journey, and I have nothing to set before him. And he will answer from within, do not bother me. The door is now shut, and my children are with me in bed. I cannot get up and give you anything. I tell you, though he will not get up and give him anything because he is his friend, yet because of his persistence, he will rise and give him whatever he needs. So that is the parable. Jesus goes on to say, and I tell you, ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks it will be opened. I think this is a beautiful passage. But there's a few ways that it is interpreted. Sometimes I do studies and I read commentaries, and I probably read too many commentaries. But I think that it's pretty plain what Jesus is saying here. But I want you to be aware of the different ways in which people interpret this. Now, this Greek word that is used here is anodeia. Okay, and this is translated as shameless or persistent. They're really synonymous for one another in what Jesus is talking about here. Now, a couple ways that it is taken is that this idea of shamelessness would be applied to the friend who's in his house. That this friend came, the neighbor, he knocked on his door and asked for these loaves of bread. And because the person that is sleeping, he first says, I don't want to help you out. But because he doesn't want to be shameful, he will arise and give his neighbor whatever he needs. Now, I think that that's a far stretch. You have to really kind of tweak and work to get that interpretation. But another interpretation that you might come across is that this idea of shamelessness is attached to the friend who comes and knocks. That there is this idea, and this I think is getting a little warmer, but this idea that there is a sense of shamelessness that would accompany this man to go to his friend's house in the middle of the night and knock on his door and have such a request. And what he's saying is, it's kind of from the lesser to the greater, okay, where Jesus does this a lot, where he says, you know, in the following passages in 11, he says, which one of you, if your son or child asked you for a fish, would give them a serpent? You know, or when Jesus said, which one of you would, if you were going to do a building project, just start it without counting the cost? It's this rhetorical question that the answer should be none of us. I wouldn't do that. You know, so it's this idea of which one of you would be shameful enough to go out in the middle of the night and knock on somebody's door and have this request. And that is what compels the friend to get up. It's not the friendship, but the shamelessness of the person who is knocking. Now, I think that's getting a little bit warmer, but I think within the context, because you got to take the whole context of Scripture, and Jesus is talking about prayer here. He's giving them a model in which to pray, and then he's saying, this is how, let me give you an example of somebody praying in this example of the friend at midnight. And then he goes on to say, so you should continue to ask and seek and knock, right? So this idea of this persistency. This neighbor was persistent. He came out and he asked for these loaves of bread because it was so important to him to do so. So he came and he knocked on his friend's house, and the friend said, leave me alone, I'm in bed. Right? And he didn't want to be bothered, and he didn't stop there and turn away because, again, it was so important to him that he would have these loaves of bread for this traveling friend that came in, that he just knocked again. And he asked again, and he continued to seek and knock. And what Jesus is getting at is that because he didn't just leave, because he continued in his persistency, the man got up out of bed and gave him whatever he needed. And I don't think that this is an illustration that Jesus typically does where he'll give a parable and then each person in the parable lines up with somebody else, where I don't think that this neighbor who is in bed represents God at all, that he hears you and, all right, I'll do what you want. But the point of the parable is to show us how we ought to approach God. Okay, that we ought to have persistency in our prayer life. So that's what this sermon is about, persistency in our prayer to God. And I don't think that Jesus is trying to make like a difference between prayer and persistent prayer. I think he's really showing us in this parable that true effective prayer is persistent prayer. It is persistent prayer. There's not really two different kinds. It's a persistency in your prayers that are effective and pleasing to God. And I think about, I come across this every once in a while where you'll have somebody who's going through something and maybe they have an ailment or a kid that's sick or something going on in their life, and they might say to you, hey, will you shoot up a prayer to God for me? Just shoot up a prayer real quick, will you? And sometimes I think Christians say that, and we don't mean anything like negative by it, but it shows you our approach kind of towards God, that I'm going through something, will you just like shoot up this prayer to God? And I think, what is more effective, or what do you guys think would be more powerful? And really think about this. Is 1,000 people praying for a specific issue one time, or one person praying for that specific issue 1,000 times? What do you think is more powerful in the eyes of God? I'm not going to give you an answer because I think both can be powerful, but I think the effectiveness of that one person persisting and persisting over maybe months, years, decades, that is pleasing to God. In fact, in verse 9, the literal rendering from the Greek is, it's not singular that we should ask and seek and knock. The idea here really is keep on asking, right? A better translation really is keep on asking, keep on seeking, keep on knocking. Keep doing it. Keep bugging God, I guess. Keep coming to Him, keep coming to Him. And where this idea of shamelessness is, it's like we continue to go to God in prayer over and over and over again to a point that it almost seems shameful to do it. And I think the best illustration of that I can give you is, remember in Genesis 18 with Abraham, and where he's like wrestling with God because God is going to wipe out Sodom. And Abraham comes and he's having this discourse with God. And like every time I read that, it made me feel kind of uncomfortable. Like, what is Abraham doing here, you know? And even in the interaction, you can tell that Abraham is kind of uncomfortable. But because there's people in that city that are his family that he loves, and it's important enough that he continues to bring it to God. And remember, he says to God, like, you are a just judge in God. Far be it for you to wipe out the righteous with the unrighteous. And I can just imagine God, you know, he could have just flicked Abraham away, because it shows you just this boldness of Abraham to speak when probably he shouldn't have. He wasn't schooling God on anything. He didn't say that to God and God say, you know, you're right, Abraham. I never really thought about that. But he allowed Abraham to continue on. And Abraham says, you know, God, if there are 50 people, 50 righteous in this city, would you wipe it out then? And God says, if there's 50 people, Abraham, I won't wipe it out. And Abraham says, God, if there were 5 less than that, if there were just 5 less, would you wipe it out then? And God says, Abraham, if there are 45 righteous people, I won't wipe it out. Abraham says, kind of got him on a roll here. God, if there were 40 people that are righteous, would you wipe it out? He says, Abraham, if there are 40, I will not. And you feel this like tension building. And Abraham is acknowledging it. And he's like, I've spoken before and I probably shouldn't say anything else. But God, if there were 30 righteous. And God says, if there are 30, I will spare it. And he goes on, if there were 20, God. And God says, if there are 20, I won't wipe it out. God, if there are 10, would you spare it? And God listens. And he says, if there are 10, Abraham, I will not wipe it out. But you understand this idea of continuing to persist in your prayers towards God to the point that it almost seems like maybe I shouldn't do this. Maybe I shouldn't come back and ask for this again. Maybe I shouldn't continue seeking out God in this particular place. And I'll tell you, if God redirects your heart and redirects your prayers, then you need to be mindful of that and you need to listen. But if He doesn't answer that prayer, or He doesn't direct your heart in a different way, then keep at it. Keep praying, keep persisting in that prayer. And I think if you're a Christian and you are following God, He's going to make your heart in line with His. I think about the fact that Abraham wasn't afraid to ask. And we shouldn't be either. And one of these things that comes to mind, and I want to share a story with you, and bear with me because it's kind of lengthy, because it has a lot of details. But I want to share the details because the details are what make it so sweet. But I remember when Robin was pregnant with Lila, and she first found out that she was pregnant, and she from the very beginning decided that she was going to devote this entire pregnancy, labor, delivery, everything over to God. And I think that we had missed out because before, I think we did in a sense, but we weren't like cognizant of it, like really turning it over to God with our first 2 children. Where we were like, God, we're not going to rely on anything else, just you. We're going to trust you in all of these things. And I remember Robin prayed very specific prayers to God. And one of them was that God would give her a baby girl. Okay? And I remember when she told me, like, and she's praying that God would give her a baby girl. And I'm like, I don't know if you can pray that. I don't know if we can do that, can we? And I'll never forget what she said. She told me, you know, God knows the desire of my heart, and He loves me, and I am His daughter. So I'm going to pray for a baby girl. Now, if God would have given us a son, we would have rejoiced and magnified and glorified His name. But He listened, and well, you know the end of the story. We have little Lila running around. But it doesn't stop there. She prayed that specifically God would be glorified in the labor and the delivery of this pregnancy. That as she went into labor and delivery, she wouldn't have to rely or depend on anything else, drugs or the other things that come in. And I'm not necessarily saying that those are a bad thing, but see, we just hadn't ever considered God maybe the way that we should in the first 2 pregnancies. And she was like, I am going to turn this completely over to Him. So she was praying for specific things in this labor and delivery, that God would be glorified, that it would not be this long process, that she would not take any drugs, that she would just completely rely on Him, that it wouldn't be accompanied by much pain. All of these things for His glory. Not because she was just trying to be selfish and be like, I don't want any of that stuff, but truly for His glory. I mean, we talk about, like, I want it to be in such a manner that the women, the nurses and doctors in labor and delivery are just standing back like, whoa, that's a big God. So she's praying like this for the entire 10 months, okay? And yes, that's right. Pregnancy is 10 months for all you people that thought it was 9. You younger ones. The women will tell you. So she's praying, and we get to the 9th month. We're about a month out from the due date, and we're praying and we're praying, and she starts having these like Braxton Hicks contractions, like the false labor. And that had happened before, but it was very mild, and this was no different in the fact that it was mild. I mean, it didn't hurt. I felt fine the entire time. No, you can ask her. She'll tell you. It wasn't that it was a painful thing, but she would have these contractions, these false labor contractions. And I would get all excited and, oh my gosh, because they would keep going for hours and hours. And where with our first couple pregnancies, we probably would have been in the hospital. But here it's our 3rd, give it some time. And so we'd wait for hours and hours, and then they'd stop. They'd dissipate and they'd go away. And then a couple days later, it would start back up. And it'd be hours and hours and hours, and we'd be like, is this the time? So it continued like that for an entire month. And I kind of was like frustrated, like, when is this going to come? What's going on? Why is she having so many of these false labors? And then we get very close to the due date. And I can't remember if we were like a couple days after or a couple days before, but we were very close to the due date. And Robin started having some of the amniotic fluid leaking. I'm sorry. She told me not to be too specific in things, but this is important. It's important that you know that. So we were worried, so we called the doctor's office, called the hospital and the charge nurse at night. We got her on the phone, and she was like, listen, if she's losing amniotic fluid, you have to come in. You need to come in tonight, and we need to induce labor. And I remember Robin was just devastated because, I mean, for literally 10 months, she had just been praying with such persistency, night and day, constantly. Like, I learned so much about prayer through the way she interacted with God during this time and the trust that she had in Him. So she was devastated and heartbroken that this was the news, like, time's up. For the safety of your baby, you need to come in. And I remember she went and she took a bath, and I came in and we prayed, and she was reading through Psalm 20, which is now her psalm. If you ask her about Psalm 20, that's her psalm now. But she just found such comfort in God because of that. And she told me, we're not going in. We've been trusting God this entire time, and He's shown us no reason not to trust Him now. So we're not going to go in. And we prayed and we prayed, and we decided. And I'll tell you what, as the father, that was very hard for me. Because if somebody's telling me that my baby is possibly in jeopardy, or that my wife could possibly be in jeopardy, she had some more peace than I did about the thing. But we trusted God in it. And the very next day, she started having these contractions again, and her water broke. The very next day, her water breaks, and it was like, okay, it's go time. Her water had never broken before. So her water broke. She took a shower, but she was so calm in this whole ordeal that I took a shower. Because, I knew we had to get to the hospital, but I didn't understand, we needed to get there quickly. So we're driving, and we get to the hospital, and she's calm through this whole thing. Eerie how calm she is. And we pull up to the hospital, and, in hindsight, I should have just taken her to the front, maybe the roundabout, but we definitely parked pretty far in the parking lot. and walked up to the hospital. And in fact, I didn't know where we were with the labor and delivery. I thought maybe we still had some time. So I said, babe, let's walk up the stairs. And she's like, you don't understand. I think that this baby is coming. So we get up to the front desk, and we start checking in, and they start giving her all the paperwork, and she's like, I need to lay down. I think that this baby is coming. And the nurses are kind of looking at her like, okay, we'll see. So they take her in, they lay her down, give her that awesome gown, and she's like, really, I think that the baby is coming. And the nurse, you can see her, she's just kind of like, okay, what is this, like your first kid? She's like, no, it's my third. And immediately her expression changed, and she was like, okay, maybe you know what you're talking about. So they check, and she's dilated to a 10, and the baby is on its way. And I kid you not, from the moment we pulled up in the parking lot till the baby was in her arms was 13 minutes. And the process was just remarkable and beautiful, and it was like God got the glory and the praise. And the reason why it was so amazing is because we specifically watched God answer prayer through that process. Like, had that happened and we never really turned it over to God, we would have been very grateful to God. But because we were in prayer that entire time specifically for that, when He answered that prayer, it was just like, God, you are so good. And you are so merciful, and you are so gracious to us. But I know sometimes it doesn't always work out like that. And sometimes people think, well, I've been praying for a very long time, years and decades for something specific, and I've been asking and asking and asking, and I don't see God answering. And I don't even know if God truly does hear me. I want to ask, in those times that you don't necessarily see God working, maybe in the way that you think He should, or that you would hope He would, I want you to really ask yourself, do you believe what Paul says in Romans 8:28? Like, do you really believe when Paul says, and we know? He didn't say, like, we think that this is the way it is. He says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. Like, I think sometimes we acknowledge that intellectually, but do we really believe that with who we are? That though I may have a vision in mind for what I think is God's will, and this path and this course that I think He would have me on, and I'm praying specifically for these things, and it doesn't seem like God is answering it. Do you understand that when God doesn't answer sometimes specifically, that's His grace? Because He sees the big picture, and we just have this tiny vision. And sometimes God is saying to us, if I know you want this. Like, I understand that you really, really want this, but if I give you this, then it forfeits all of this. And I really want to give you all of this, so I can't give you this. But it's because He cares for you, and He sees the big picture, and He has your best interest in mind. He has your best interest in mind far greater than even you do. So it's this idea of trusting Him. And where I really learned this was when I first joined the Coast Guard. And I went to the Coast Guard because I wanted to be a rescue swimmer. I'm from Salt Lake City. I didn't know anything about the Coast Guard other than they had this rescue swimmer program. And I knew that it was going to be hard. I knew that it was going to stretch me. And I wanted to do it. It was a challenge. So that is all I was focused on. And this is when I really started obeying and following Christ. And so it was at the same time that I'm convinced that this is the will of God for me, because doors started opening and all these things started happening quite rapidly. So I'm on this course to become a rescue swimmer. But before I can go to the actual school, you have to go to your first duty station after you go to boot camp. So you go to boot camp, then you go to your first duty station, you kind of pay your dues. And I'm there between about a year and a half. And every day, training, getting myself ready to go to this school that I know is going to be just grueling. And then I actually make it to the school, and it's 8 months long. 8 months long of just getting destroyed every single day. And I got to the end of the 6th month. And at the end of the 6th month, things were going very well. And I remember in this time, because I was being stretched so far, my prayer life with God was pretty incredible, because I really was forced to rely on Him so much. And it came to the end of this 6 months where I'm just seeing God working in all these things. I'm getting excited. There's only 2 months more left to go. And, you know, all the last 2 years of hard work is going to pay off. And at the end of the 6 months, I get a stress fracture in my foot. And the doctors actually recommend, because of the placement and everything and what it can do to the bones, that it could actually affect my quality of life just in my day-to-day. So they don't recommend me for rephasal, which is to go back a couple of months and continue. They drop me from the program. And they send me to Baltimore, Maryland. And I'm doing military police work up there. And I remember getting there, and again, I was devastated, because I had committed the last 2 years of my life to this specific thing, and I was convinced that that is where God wanted me to be. I was convinced God wanted me to be a rescue swimmer. And when it all came crumbling down, I was devastated. I was confused. I was depressed. I had no idea what was going on or what God had in store. But I went from there, to give you the fast-track version, to a weapons expert school, and then I went to San Francisco, and that's where I got placed on the SWAT division. And in this tight group of guys, one of the guys had a wife that worked in Berkeley at the Wells Fargo. She just happened to work with this smoking hot brunette, all right? And I can talk about it in front of my wife, because it is my wife. So again, in hindsight, I look at what I wanted compared to what God wanted to give me. And I had to go through some pain, and I had to go through some discomfort, and I had to go through this period of doubting. But now I look back and I see so clearly, God, thank you so much for not specifically giving me what I asked for. Thank you for having something so much greater in store for me. And see, the problem with that, though, is sometimes you don't always see, like I have gotten the opportunity to in this situation, you don't always see that here in this life. But I promise you, as you trust God, you know that ultimately you're going to look back on these things and say, thank you, Lord. Thank you for not giving me what I asked for in that moment, because your plan was so much greater. So we need to keep asking God. Keep on asking Him with the understanding that His plan is so much greater. And then we need to continue to seek. Seek after what? I really think seeking after Him, seeking after His will for our life. See, the psalmist David wrote in Psalm 27:8, you have said, he's talking to God here, you have said, seek my face. I love David's response, because he says, my heart says to you, your face, Lord, I will seek. David is saying, you have told me to seek your face, and everything in me is saying, yes, God, your face is what I will seek. And David spent his entire life, he didn't do it perfectly, but he spent his life seeking after God and seeking after the will of God. Now, that is why God accredited David with being a man after His own heart. Now, other than the words spoken from God, well done, my good and faithful servant, could you imagine Him accrediting you, Carlene, as a woman after His own heart? Or Richard as a man after His own heart? You know, I want that to be my title. I want God to look at me and say, now there is a person who is after my heart, who seeks after me. And Jesus tells us in Matthew 6, he's doing the Sermon on the Mount, and And I find it remarkable because he's talking to the Israelite people, okay? And he's telling them, listen, don't go seeking after all this other stuff. And it wasn't like other stuff that they shouldn't be seeking after. This was like the bare essentials for you to be able to live, okay? It wasn't like these things that they didn't need. This was food and water and shelter, your basic necessities. But Jesus is telling them even then, don't go pursuing those things. Don't go seeking after those things. That's what the pagans do. See, the pagans don't understand the big picture. So they see, I need water, I'm going to seek after water. Or I need food, I'm going to seek after food. I need shelter, I'm going to seek after shelter. And Jesus is saying, God knows you and loves you and is more familiar with you and knows the things that you need far greater than you know them yourself. So rather than seeking after those things, seek first the kingdom of God, and all those things will be added unto you. Right? So it's what we are pursuing, what we are seeking. And that is why we must continue to persistently ask. We must continue to persistently seek after God and His will for us. Because that'll impact the things that you ask for. It all ties together. And then we must persistently continue to knock on doors that may seem closed tight. We must continue to knock. I think the reason why we don't knock like we should is because, one, when I come to a door, I'd just rather it be open. I'd rather the door be open and I'll walk through it. And if I do have to knock, I'd like to knock once, maybe twice, and it would be nice of you to open that door. See, we are enveloped in this culture that wants instant gratification. We are so used to that. If I want something, I usually can get it now. Isn't that what like progression is you create something that gives us what we want faster? That's what it is. And I want to ask you this, and I really want you to think about it. In instant gratification, other than getting what you want right away, is there any other thing that's beneficial in that? Like, can you think of anything else that's beneficial in instant gratification other than getting what you want right away? So the thing is, and let me put it like this. You think about a little kid, right? If you know of a little kid who constantly gets everything that he wants, every time he asks for something, he gets it right away. Right away, right away. Mom, I want this. Dad, I want this. Yes, 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 yes. Constantly with instant gratification. Do you think that that kid is going to have patience? Think that he's going to have endurance? Or do you think maybe he'll even be generous? Or do you think that kid will maybe turn out to be a spoiled little brat? See, maybe that's what it is. God wants us to continue asking, continue seeking, continue knocking, because He doesn't want you to be a bunch of little spoiled brats. He wants us to continue to seek after these things because, in a real sense, it shows us and it demonstrates to God those things that are important to us. Because if they're not really important to you, you'll knock a couple times and you'll move on. But if they are important, you'll stay at that door and you'll keep knocking. And I don't want you to get discouraged if you've been asking and seeking and knocking for a very long time. Just keep doing it. Excuse me. Just keep doing it. I think of some friends that I have in California. And this is a couple who loves the Lord dearly. And I know that most of you probably have friends like this, where they are phenomenal people. They love the Lord. They've got so many things going for them, except for tragically, they cannot have children. And they want children bad. They pray often for children. And this particular couple is a godly couple. And they continue to ask, they continue to seek, they continue to knock. They've been doing this for over 10 years now. And that door to this day remains shut. But they're not going to stop knocking. They're not going to stop knocking on that door because they trust God. Now, if He changes their heart's desire to something else and puts it upon their heart to stop asking, then they'll come to that when they come to it. But to this point, they're going to keep knocking. They're going to keep asking. They're going to keep seeking. And they should, because it's pleasing to God. So if you're here today and you're frustrated because you think, I've been asking so many times for the salvation of my children, or I've been going through this medical thing for years and years and years, and I've been asking God to take it from me, and He hasn't. Or if you're asking God to give you freedom from this addiction or from this depression or whatever it may be, keep asking. Keep seeking. Keep knocking. You know, some people say, I've been doing it for decades. Well, you're going to stop? You're going to stop now? After you've done it for so many years? Keep at it. That's what God is saying. He wants you to do it because it's pleasing to Him. Don't stop asking. Don't stop seeking His face. Don't stop knocking on those doors that seem to be closed tight, because He has the power to open them. He has the power to answer your prayers far greater than you could even imagine possible. And when He does it, it's going to be for your best interest. And it may not look the way that you think it will look, but it will be infinitely greater, that I promise. So don't give up. Be encouraged today, please. Be encouraged that you serve a God that is in control of everything. And be shameless in the way you pursue Him. And keep on asking, keep on seeking, and keep on knocking.